Hi. Is it that time?
It is. Sorry. Hi. I'm Daniel. It's nice to meet you. Did you want to hold a microphone or clip one on your lapel?
I'd be just as happy just doing the clip on.
Okay. Would you like me to clip it on, or are you okay?
I think I'm probably
Okay.
all right. Let's see how it goes. So on the lapel or on the
your tie. Tie's good.
Did you want to do a sound check? Or?
No, I think we're okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
you
thank
think
you.
it'll be fine?
Yeah.
Thanks. Is it on now?
It's not coming through the speakers, but it is on. The microphone
Okay,
is
so
on,
you'll flip it when the time comes. All right, thanks.
All right, you're welcome.
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. This feels very official in this space, but we are live streaming the event, so the audio, I understand, is better if I use this microphone. So we're going to. Thank you all for being here. My name is Alicia LaMagdalene. I'm head of school here at University High School. And we are just so thrilled to be partnering with Indiana Humanities this year with the One State, One Story project. So our fall read, we do a summer read every year that all students, 9 through 12, read, the faculty read, we discuss together, was World of Wonders by Amy Nezukumatatel, who has now been chosen for the whole state to read. And I thank Nyla Neely, who some of you have interfaced with, because why we picked that book was that Nyla said we needed to. And it was, in fact, true. I hadn't read it. She had, and as soon as I read it, I fell in love with it. And it's led us to kind of an exploration here about the idea of wonder in our natural world that actually paired up really well with the times that we're living in and the fact that many of us spent those early days of COVID sitting in our backyards or on our front porches or taking a walk and hearing sounds and paying attention to small things that we hadn't paid attention to in a while. And so we've been thinking about all the different ways in which the world around us informs our learning and informs our work. And tonight's talk isn't part about that. So that's my way of intro. I'm going to turn it over, though, to University High School senior Allie Skolnick, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Hello, my name is Allie Skolnick, and I'm a senior. By taking courses such as AP Biology, Environmental Science, Zoology, and working on an independent research project here at university, I've been able to explore my interest in environmental science and determine my intention to continue the study in college. Therefore, it's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker. Frederick Fritz Davis is a professor and head of the Department of History at Purdue University. He also holds the R. Mark Lubbers Chair in the History of Science. He studied at Harvard, the University of Florida, and Yale. His research connects the history of environmental science, environmental health, and environmental history. He recently published Banned, A History of Pesticides and the Science of Toxicology. He also wrote The Man Who Saved Sea Turtles, Archie Carr, and the Origins of Conservation Biology. He relishes the opportunity to share the inspirational story of Rachel Carson and the wonder of nature. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fritz Davis.
Thank you. We'll just turn this one off. There we go. And save it for questions, hopefully, later on. Thank you so much, Allie. I really appreciate the introduction. Thank you also to Alicia LaMagdalene, but especially to Nyla Neely for all of their efforts in organizing tonight's event. I really appreciate this emphasis here at the school on wonder, and many of the themes that Alicia mentioned are very much a part of the talk tonight. So, to be honest, this is the first event I've attended in person in a long time. So I think it's really is a pleasure to be out and about. So welcome, and it's good to see all of you. The other thing is, we should say, although I have a text and I'm going to be reading, if something occurs to you either from the images or from what I'm saying, just raise your hand or interrupt, because even if you do derail my train of thought, I think that's usually when interesting things happen. So I hope we can be fairly informal, even though we're apparently live streaming and there's a microphone. So yeah. So anyway, if at any time you want to comment or interject, please, by all means, do that. So for quite a few years, I taught the history of medicine. And it was always really a pleasure to introduce students to the challenge that was the 1918 influenza pandemic And we would talk about the distinction between a global pandemic and a regional epidemic, and how there was this disease near the end of World War I that actually claimed the lives of more than 500,000 Americans. And then so many more people worldwide. And we talked about, and we would talk in this class about masking and social distancing and how this became a part of American society. And then I would show them these amazing images of people masked, and then actually of entire sort of public health corps, with everyone masked and all of society. Needless to say, I don't need to introduce them to these concepts anymore. I think COVID enforced a new familiarity with pandemic disease and the impact that it can have on society. Now, in my history of disease and medicine courses, I really emphasized that disease matters. And for anyone who's lived through the past 2 years, I don't really think that that's a case that we need to make. So tonight, I'd like to make a slightly different case, and that's that, and the case tonight is nature matters. And to do that, we'll take a close look at the life and writings of one of the greatest American writers, Rachel Carson. Here she is when she was at the Fish and Wildlife Service in Washington, D.C. In all of her writings, Carson inspired and fostered emotions in her readers. Her books about the sea introduced readers to incredible animals and wondrous places that lay just beneath the waters of seascapes. Her descriptions of predator-prey relationships and life histories capture the intricacies of life in the sea. Carson addressed the significance of wonder specifically in an article she published in 1958 under the title, "Help Your Child to Wonder." For Carson, the sense of wonder was a key component of childhood, and it was lost in most adults. Wonder enabled people to connect with nature and the environment. Despite the dark subject of Silent Spring, namely the impact that chemical insecticides were having on the environment and the ways in which chemical insecticides were disrupting the fabric of life, as Carson referred to it, Carson managed to draw on the scientific literature and incorporated references to poetry and prose to animate a challenging and disturbing topic. But beyond wonder, Silent Spring elicited other emotions, namely anger and righteous indignation. Americans found the notion that we were poisoning our environment to be very, very disturbing, and it sort of prompted action on the part of Americans. And Carson's writings very much inspired the political movement that became the environmental movement. The biographical details of Carson's books about the sea have been clearly documented. Although she was committed to writing from an early age, Carson discovered her muse during a trip to the Marine Biological Laboratory at Woods Hole. The sea and the creatures within provided a limitless well of stories for her to research and then to craft. After college, she went on to Johns Hopkins University, where she completed a master's in biology and began the doctoral program. But she eventually had to withdraw to find a better paying job. She was, after all, the sole breadwinner in her eclectic family, which included her mother and her father, who struggled with illness, and as well as her divorced sister and two young nieces. The family's dependency on Carson increased when her father died in 1935 and her sister in 1937, at which point Carson became in loco parentis to her grandnephew, Roger. So she was at the center, and like I said, the sole breadwinner at the heart of this very, very eclectic family in the late 1950s. In adversity, she found strength, and she landed a job as a writer at the Bureau of Fisheries, which was later absorbed by Fish and Wildlife. She wrote about the Bureau programs and eventually drafted an essay that her supervisor did not feel was really appropriate to the writings of the Bureau, so she submitted it to the popular magazine, The Atlantic, where it essentially launched her career in scientific writing. She published, based on the article in The Atlantic, she published a book called Under the Sea Wind. Unfortunately, that came out in 1941. It was released on the eve of Pearl Harbor. And as a result, people were not very interested in reading about the wonders of the sea. So that book initially was a failure. Here she is collecting marine organisms at the seashore. So someone with less fortitude or less confidence in her writing ability might have abandoned the quest for a reading public. But Carson launched a second book project, which would reveal the wonders of contemporary marine biology to her readers. In her dark moments, Carson referred to the new project as Out of My Depth, or Carson at Sea, when she just was sort of struggling with the writing. In an infamous editorial lapse, the editor of The Atlantic dismissed the piece as too poetic. So Carson shopped it to William Shawn at The New Yorker. And Shawn recognized a unique perspective on a little-known subject, and ultimately most of the sea around us appeared across 3 issues of the magazine to the delight of readers. It was the first profile of anything other than a person that appeared in The New Yorker. Sea Around Us won the National Book Award in 1952, and it soon appeared on the New York Times bestseller list and remained there for 86 weeks, which was a record at the time. When it was reissued, her first book, Under the Sea Wind, joined The Sea Around Us on the bestseller list. So ultimately that book, despite its sort of slow start, also became a runaway bestseller. For Carson, literary acclaim and popular success gave her the opportunity to resign from her government job, and she turned to writing full-time. And then she also enjoyed a measure of financial independence at that point, so she bought a cottage on the coast of Maine and promptly began to write a third book, The Edge of the Sea. So the book I'm working on now is called Making Silent Spring, and it's the book that I originally planned as my dissertation 26 years ago. But my dissertation evolved into a study of the evolution of pesticides and the science of toxicology across the 20th century. And so that book is the book that Allie mentioned, Banned, A History of Pesticides and the Science of Toxicology. And Carson and Silent Spring figure prominently in that book as well. But above all, the book reveals how Carson emphasized risks associated with pesticides other than DDT, namely a class of insecticides known as organophosphates, some of which are still used in agriculture today. That class of insecticides includes some of the most toxic chemicals known to humankind. And I thought it was profoundly ironic that the organophosphates, which were highly toxic not just to birds and mammals and humans and farm workers as well, it was after DDT was banned, farmers, because DDT was no longer available, turned to the organophosphates, but with consequences for wildlife and farm workers alike. But that's a story for another time. I still wanted to document the scientific sources to Silent Spring. What was the basis for her dramatic expose of the dangers of indiscriminate use of insecticides to wildlife, ecosystems, and even humans? But to understand her ecological worldview, which is absolutely vital to Silent Spring, we need to examine ecology as she characterizes it in her books about the sea, which I argue it's just as important. In Under the Sea Wind, Carson constructed a series of intersecting life histories through the lives of the creatures that occupy the shorelines. Carson assembled an ecological narrative. As she noted in the introduction, she confronted the problem of a central character of the narrative, since no single animal could live in all parts of the sea that she would describe. She wrote, "That problem was instantly solved, however, when I realized that the sea itself must be the central character, whether I wished it or not. For the sense of the sea, holding the power of life and death over every one of its creatures, from the smallest to the largest, would inevitably pervade every page." So in 5 focused chapters, Carson introduces a variety of animals. She provides each of the animals a name. And so she focuses on these central characters, but she avoids the charge of anthropomorphism by deploying the scientific name for each species as their name in the story. So as a result, readers become accustomed to the language of naturalists and scientists, but in a very sort of, non-confrontational way. It's not like they have to learn the scientific names. They just assimilate them because those are the names that Carson gave them. She broke with that pattern in two instances with sanderlings, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then also some of the animals in the Arctic areas where sanderlings nest. And there she shifted to the more appropriate Inuit names. I'd like to push this notion a little further. In her Earthsea trilogy, Ursula Le Guin wrote about how aspiring wizards develop power and control. And how did they do that? They learn the names of all creatures in nature. And in a very similar move with her naming scheme, Carson makes the scientific names knowable. Just as the wizards had to learn the secret names of animals, so too did Carson educate her readers in America. So ultimately, she was instilling in readers more knowledge than they may have realized. Oh, that's the quote from Carson. And here's a sanderling from, some of you may be familiar. This is from the wintering grounds, Sanibel Island off the coast of southwest Florida. So in the next chapter, she described 2 sanderlings, one a male named Blackfoot and a female named Silverbar, which served as a focal point in a flock of several hundred shorebirds that had arrived that night. So here Carson departed from the standard practice in giving the sanderlings popular names, possibly because the genus name Calidris nor the species name alba, white, had any particular resonance. There just wasn't anything very notable about those names. There are a lot of species of shorebirds referred to as Calidris. And then also Carson tried to distinguish between the male and the female. So Blackfoot, the male, was on his 4th round-trip journey from southernmost South America to the Arctic nesting grounds, 8,000 miles one way. It was a spectacular migration for a bird that's barely 8 inches long. After the morning feeding frenzy, the shorebirds retired to rest above the tide line. A beach flea came out to feed, but a ghost crab, quote, sprang like a pouncing cat and seized the flea in its large crushing claw, or chela, and devoured it. While the shorebirds slept on the beach, a snowy egret fed on killifish in the bright sun of the midday. Meanwhile, fishermen, and humans were always part of Carson's story, fishermen prepared to drag a seine through the shallows, and the shorebirds in turns were roused from their sleep. Distracted by the birds and startled by the fishermen, a ghost crab sought refuge in the surf, where an opportunistic and large channel bass struck and devoured it. Later, a school of sharks attacked the bass, the remains of which washed up on shore, where scavenging beach fleas devoured them. Like so many other scenes in Under the Sea Wind, this one captures the food webs and the ecological relationships that constitute the balance of nature. The focus on the economy of nature recalls Gilbert White's The Natural History of Selborne. Book 2 focuses on the Atlantic mackerel, scientific name Scomber scombris, personified by Scomber, a single individual out of tens of millions, a single individual that Carson followed from the egg to adulthood. Which is to say, she followed the mackerel's life history. But rather than just talking about the natural history of mackerel, she focuses on this single individual, Scomber. Carson described the continental shelf, 50 to 150 miles offshore, and she notes that it's not the distance from the shore that characterizes the transition to true sea, but the depth of the water, 100 fathoms. Phenology is the science of the timing of natural events, and Carson explored this topic as well. Mackerel spent the 4 coldest months in winter in a state of torpor, their life systems dependent on reserves stored during the summer before. She wondered if perhaps ocean currents carried to the mackerel some awareness of the vegetation flourishing in the waters above with the arrival of spring. She also wondered if it was the flooding into the sea from melting ice and snow from rivers with a corresponding reduction in the salinity of the marine waters. This is all highly speculative, but it shows that it wasn't really clear to anyone how mackerel perceived the change in the seasons, but nevertheless they responded quickly, emerging from the depths by the thousands and tens of thousands. Carson characterized the abundance of mackerel with respect to geography. The numbers of mackerel are so great as to darken the shore. She wrote, throughout those weeks when the fish are rolling in from the open sea to the scattered shoals between the edge of the continent and the shore are often darkened as the earth was once dimmed by the passing of another living cloud, the flights of passenger pigeons. And here's one artist's rendition from 1875 of what the flights of passenger pigeons look like, where literally naturalists estimated single flocks of numbering 3 billion birds. And it's that scale that Carson compares the schools of mackerel to. Really just spectacular numbers. When the mackerel reach the nearshore spawning grounds, they release their eggs and milt. Carson wrote, they leave in their wake a cloud of transparent spheres of infinitesimal size, a vast sprawling river of life, the sea's counterpart of the river of stars that flows through the sky as the Milky Way. There are known to be hundreds of millions of eggs to the square mile, billions in an area a fishing vessel could cruise in over an hour. Hundreds of trillions in the entire spawning area. Unimaginably minute eggs of mind-boggling numbers, comparable only to the stars in the Milky Way. Carson shifts between scales seamlessly with vivid analogies. It is shifts like these to bring to my mind the study of big history, which with comparable emphasis on scale from the Big Bang to globalization. That's roughly the trajectory that big history focuses on. From the spectacular abundance of mackerel spawn, Carson turns to the life history of a single individual, beginning with its embryology. Life began as a tiny globule no larger than a poppy seed, one of 40 to 50,000 eggs shed by one female fish. Out of millions of eggs that accompanied the one that would produce scomber, thousands did not make it past the first stage of the journey before being swept up by comb jellies, or ctenophores. Even a change in the weather spelled doom for the mackerel eggs. Hordes of comb jellies and glassworms, copepods and shrimp, medusae of jellyfish, winged snails, and even crab larvae all fed on the superabundant eggs. Just 6 nights after spawning, the egg that contained scomber split open and released a tiny fish, or fishlet. Like mackerel eggs, recent hatchlings, like scomber, also face many dangers. Other larger fish, such as anchovies, could eat the tiny mackerel. Young mackerel avoided other fish by spending their days many fathoms beneath the surface of the ocean and rising with their chief food source, plankton, during the night. In Carson's telling, young mackerel shifted between potential sources of food and potential sources of danger. So sort of the constant oscillation of life. Humans, fishers, were also part of the ocean ecosystem. And Carson renders fishing vessels and fishing devices as yet another danger faced by the young mackerel scomber, as well as the mackerel schools as a whole. By comparing ships to giant fish, Carson incorporated fishers and their vessels into the predator-prey relationships that were so much part of marine ecosystems. Fishers knew their prey. Captains would attempt a set. The seine boat would complete 3 revolutions around a massive mackerel school. On the 3rd pass, the fishermen in the seine boat passed one of the end of the seine net to 2 fishermen in a dory. The net was 1,200 feet long, so encompassing a spectacular area, and dropped to a depth of 100 feet. And there then Carson jumps back to the mackerel's perspective. Once again, scomber escapes certain death, first when the mackerel school sounds, which meant they dove, before the net closed and escaped, and in another case when dogfish ripped through the net, thereby releasing the mackerel as well. As the story of an individual mackerel, scomber's life is a work of fiction, or perhaps in Tom Wolfe's phrase, faction, where a lot of it's factual, but the story is still a work of fiction. Scomber's story is that of any mackerel, all of which must survive myriad encounters with predators at all stages of their lives. So to focus solely on scomber's good fortune, right, to survive all these dangers in the sea from the time scomber was an egg till scomber was an adult, is to miss Carson's larger thesis. Namely, all of the animals in the sea interacted with as predators in one moment and his prey in the next. By following Scomber through his many encounters with predators, Carson informs the reader about the ecology of predator-prey relationships. So I'd like to skip ahead now to help your child to wonder, or the sense of wonder. Carson developed this idea. The idea, what she referred to as the opportunity to explore, depended less on the ability to travel than on the willingness to explore the wonder of nature through our senses. And this, she felt, was accessible to everyone, even in our backyards. Carson developed this idea in Help Your Child to Wonder, an article she wrote for Women's Home Companion in 1956, not long after The Edge of the Sea was published. 9 years later, another version with many evocative black and white photos was published as a book, a coffee table book, really. It was published the year after Carson died in 1965. And it's this version, the book version, that many have read. How many have seen it, know it? It's really a wonderful book. It's well worth finding in a used bookstore. I don't think they've republished it recently. She opens with a nighttime walk with her 20-month-old grandnephew to the Maine shore in the midst of an autumn storm. And she writes about that experience both for her and then also for her 20-month-old grandnephew. And she would later report that Roger had developed a keen appreciation of nature. Carson generalized the child's experience of nature, fresh and new and beautiful, full of wonder and excitement. Sadly, wonder for most people was ephemeral and lost before adulthood. For parents who found themselves overwhelmed at the thought of trying to learn everything about nature, and it's not hard to imagine that Carson's vast knowledge of nature and the sea was intimidating, but Carson gave this simple advice. Ultimately, although I think at the moment, I think we're fascinated by the size of the storm, which seems to be growing as I talk. So, hopefully we'll keep power. So the point of this statement is that ultimately a passion for nature followed the emotional connection. So, joy in nature followed wonder, which I think is a profound statement. In all of her books, she inspired wonder in her readers. And it seems to me that Carson accessed this emotion by sharing with her readers her own sense of wonder regarding all aspects of the sea and the diversity of plants and animals that live therein, as well as the interactions among them. Just as Carson experienced amazement in contemplating the many predator-prey relationships and complex life histories of so many species in the oceans and along seashores, her readers gladly followed her in this process of discovery. Carson's fascination with the sea proved infectious, and readers found themselves drawn into the marine world of wonder. So I'd like to move on to Silent Spring, which became Carson's best-known book. It was also a bestseller, but it was quite different from her books about the sea. She showed how agricultural chemicals threaten chemicals, humans, and the very fabric of life. She drew on the scientific literature and incorporated references to poetry and prose to animate a challenging and disturbing topic. However, as I mentioned earlier, she managed to elicit other emotions, namely anger. In light of the many references to dying birds, dead fish, and polluted landscapes, one obvious emotion would be sadness and a sense of loss. And the sense that Silent Spring is a tragedy permeates nearly every page. But Carson wisely chose not to emphasize loss, which was a smart decision on her part. Sadness and loss, while necessary aspects of grieving, may not inspire action. If anything, the depression that accompanies loss can lead to overwhelming sense of hopelessness. Environmental writers and activists struggle with what Bill Cronin has called declensionist narratives, stories that just keep getting worse. By the fall of 1958, Carson had been collecting information and writing chapter drafts that would become Silent Spring. But she struggled to marshal the vast amount of material she had collected and present it in a compelling way to her readership. Even the title had gone through a series of changes. One title was Man Against Nature. Another title was How to Balance Nature. And ultimately, her publisher settled on The Control of Nature. But on October 7, 1958, she received an unsolicited letter from a then young scientist, a biologist at Harvard by the name of Edward O. Wilson. Some of you may realize that Wilson died just a couple months ago after a very, very long and distinguished career as one of the leading figures in biology in America. But at this time, Carson had only recently been tenured at Harvard, and he wrote, he had heard that Carson was writing this book about chemical insecticides, and he had advice. So I guess you can't really read it. So he said, I'd like to mention two other publications. Elton's Ecology of Invasions contains a wealth of material, and then also he sent her, he recommended another publication as well, but it was Elton's Ecology of Invasions that caught Carson's attention. And just a few weeks later, she wrote back, I'm already indebted to you for many things, but perhaps most of all for your reference to Elton's Ecology of Invasions. I'd not heard of it until you mentioned it, although I know his earlier work on populations. I found this enormously stimulating. It cuts through all the foggy discussion of insect pests and their control like a keen north wind. So clearly Carson found value in Elton's ecology of invasions by animals and plants. And I argued that the ecology of invasions profoundly influenced Rachel Carson as she endeavored to connect water and soil pollution to pest and weed control. Moreover, she could connect these environmental toxins to wildlife and health. Before she read Elton's book, Carson had already amassed considerable evidence of the effects of chemical insecticides. But Elton's book reinforced her thoughts regarding the relationship between the various kinds of risks in the environment. So it's the connections, it's the connective tissue that Elton's Ecology of Invasions provided Carson in Silent Spring. Not only was she able to connect various sciences, science of ecology, science of toxicology, as well as the study of cancer biology. She also bridged the ever-widening gap between the science produced in the halls of academia and the science consumed by average Americans and policymakers. So I don't think anyone has fully explored Elton's significance to Carson's thinking. Here's Charles Elton in the middle with William Roden and the wildlife biologist Aldo Leopold. They all knew each other and interacted at conferences. She liked Elton's reference to big fish eat small ones, which sort of captures, again, predator-prey relationships in the sea, and she particularly appreciated his reference to Bruegel's big fish eat small ones, shown here, from 1556. Silent Spring was published in May of 1962 in The New Yorker across 3 issues. That issue is very difficult to find, so if you ever do see one, it's well worth having. And then in the fall of that year, in the book form, Silent Spring, shown there on the right. First editions of that book are also very hard to find so well worth exploring. Drawing directly on Elton, Carson wrote, "The control of nature is a phrase conceived in arrogance, born of the Neanderthal age of biology and philosophy, when it was supposed that nature exists for the convenience of man. The concepts and practices of applied entomology, for the most part, date from that stone age of science. It is our alarming misfortune that so primitive a science has armed itself with the most modern and terrible weapons, and that in turning them against the insects, it has also turned them against the earth." So the ecology of invasions galvanized Rachel Carson's thinking about the relationships between environmental toxins and ecosystems, wildlife, and humans. More than 50 years after the publication of Silent Spring, Carson's polemic against the indiscriminate use of chemicals in the environment still challenges readers to question attempts to control nature and to consider the unintended consequences that such efforts pose to wildlife, ecosystems, and humans. Another quotation that talks about the web of life or death that scientists know as ecology. Although the themes of wonder and tragedy and loss play an important role in the story that Carson tells in Silent Spring, she avoided the perils of hopelessness by calling forth another emotion, namely anger, righteous anger, at the threat that pesticides pose to ecosystems, animals, and even humans, and particularly the role that some humans were playing in this growing threat. And it's the righteous anger that motivated political action, which helped to fuel the environmental movement in America. To paraphrase Carson, in her books about the sea, she had prepared the soil that was the basis of wonder in her readers, something that she isolated in her article, Help Your Child to Wonder. Silent Spring, while capturing the elements of wonder and scale, so prominent in her other books about the sea, also elicited these feelings of anger in readers, some of whom translated those feelings to action. And then here is a statue that is in front of the entomology building at Purdue. It's remarkable in that it shows the head of entomology. This is entomology as chemical entomology, the study of agricultural chemicals. And that is the first head of entomology standing tall, and Rachel Carson presenting a butterfly to a child who happens to be the young, the person who would succeed the first head of entomology. It's a really interesting sculpture. At times, I believe we're at a similar crossroads today. During the worst of the pandemic and the global shutdown, many people look to nature for comfort and solace. Rachel Carson's writings, wisdom, and her profound sense of wonder can still serve as a valuable guide to a deeper appreciation and understanding of the world in which we live. Thank you. So we have time for questions. If everyone wants to we're still in reasonable time, I guess. If there are any questions.
I'd like to hear more about the sculpture. Are you sensing some irony there?
I hope so.
Yeah.
So do you want to just, so the question is about the sculpture, and I'll go back to the sculpture. Yeah, so I think this is an effort to, it's sort of a very formal apology, I think, in a sense. It's a way of saying that the attacks that some agricultural chemists at Purdue leveled at Carson might have been misdirected. It might have been more appropriately directed at other bodies that were, rather than the person who was Rachel Carson. I think she caught the brunt of an inordinate amount of frustration with a problem that Purdue scientists are still struggling with today. And they raised this when I gave a version of this talk on campus, which is that how do you feed 7 billion people without agricultural chemicals? And I'm not sure we've come up with a solution to that problem. So I think there's a really valid point there. It is a real challenge, but the management of agricultural chemicals is an ongoing challenge. Was there another question? I can, just so other people can hear you. No.
This thing up there. One of my favorite quotes is from Rachel Carson: is, "If a child is to keep alive his inborn sense of wonder, he must have at least one knowing adult to share it with." Openly admit, I'm an early childhood science guru in my day job, and I found it interesting her connection with her nephew, or her grandnephew, and I think that's probably where that quote came from. Is there any reference in your studies of does she feel that way because of her studies with her son or her nephew, or was it because she discovered that she saw that throughout all of her work in the wildlife field?
No, I think you're onto something. I think it really was sort of the direct experience of watching Roger grow up in nature, and then also, I think that scene in Maine where they went out in the middle of the storm and the waves were crashing, and he had no reason to be afraid. He was in the arms of his, basically the person who was, for all intents and purposes, his mother, and they both just thoroughly enjoyed the experience of nature. So I think you're absolutely right that she is, through Roger's eyes, seeing the wonder in nature, and then also really wondering about how wonder dissipates across the lifespan to where it's harder to access among adults. Although, I think part of the larger point of Carson's message is that I think, I think as Alicia pointed out, it's something that we rediscovered in the past 2 years. When we were so limited in so many respects, one of the ways that people, got out of the house and got away from the pandemic was getting out into nature. The celery bog is, this beautiful 200-acre wetland forest in West Lafayette. It's just a postage stamp by any kind of measure. And so I think there's, I have to say I'm really excited about the plans for the campus here, because it's remarkable what very, very small measures can, the kind of impact that they can have. Thank you.
Wait, celery grows in bogs?
It did, and it was white celery, apparently because it didn't get the chlorophyll that makes celery green. But since the time that celery was grown in the celery bog, it's overgrown and overgrown again. So this is all secondary forest. This is post-agricultural forest, and yet, it's home to dozens of nesting species and thousands of migrant birds and other animals as well.
I just was wondering, what was the shift from the wonder to her doing the studies on pesticides? Where, when she was out in the field, was she seeing a lot of destruction, like dead animals and fish and stuff, or?
So in that case, she had a good friend, several good friends, but one in particular wrote to her about the destruction that USDA programs were having in the wetlands of Long Island. And the friend that really got her attention was Marjorie Spock. And Marjorie Spock, among other things, was the brother of Benjamin Spock. You know, who many of you know as the, you know, sort of the America's pediatrician. I think it's how Benjamin Spock was known. Marjorie Spock, this is interesting, was passionate about organic foods. This is in the 1950s. Absolutely passionate about, impassioned about organic foods and the, you know, the opportunities that they provided to avoid agricultural chemicals. Carson never mentions organic food in Silent Spring. I think because already it was kind of associated, well, I think less now than then, but it was associated with sort of radical fringe elements, and she wanted to focus on the science in Silent Spring and not have the book associated with the organic movement. Yeah, so that's how.
It sounds like the whole Carson text on wonder of nature would be something university could really embrace as we work on our outdoor learning environment, which is a work in progress. Would it be possible as they work on that to contact you and make sure we get it right?
Yeah, that would be really fun. I mean, I think one thing that's really nice that I've seen in other parks is, you know, little plaques with quotations, not just necessarily from Carson, but Aldo Leopold and John Muir and some of these others, where, you know, in the, when you see, it's one thing to hear these, you know, Louis Agassiz's study nature, not books. Well, you probably don't want to emphasize, don't want to lean on that one too hard, but at the same time, but those kinds of quotes, I think in the right context can really, you know, sort of bring the experience, add to the experience. That would be terrific.
Okay, I'm going to come at this from a very personal perspective. Part of what brought me here tonight is a background in environmental science, studied in college, and certainly a connection early on with Silent Spring and Rachel Carson. But the definition of the word wonder can go a lot of ways. And so from a very personal perspective, the wonder in our lives, in my family, have to do with thinking back to, you know, her early work in pesticides and all, and what that's done to the food chain and to animals and to humans. 11 years ago, my father was diagnosed with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and he passed away 8 years ago. I have 2 older siblings. In the last 6 years, both of them have been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease.
Yeah.
So the wonder in that case has sent us into a whole different direction as to how all of these things have come about. And the hints are pointing in the direction of pesticides. So not to put a damper on all this, but certainly, man, she was right on so many years ago. And how many of us continue to learn the consequences of all of those decisions about our food process along the way?
Yeah, the connection with Parkinson's, I mean, it's so protracted, right? This is over a lifetime, but there is increasing evidence that early exposures to chemical insecticides, particularly among the farming community, is associated, and you know, we all know the distinction between association and correlation, or association and causation, but there is this association. So my dad was the one who, like, actually, you know, yeah, so I'm trying to think how to phrase it. So he was actually one who, he educated me to how farmers saw DDT. And the way that it, transformed agriculture when it was introduced. And he knew because, he was on the farm when his dad introduced it. Yeah, that's probably too personal. Yeah.
So I have two unrelated questions. One is, I haven't read a lot of her work. I just learned about her to come here. How does you said she brings up humans in her work and their role, and you also mentioned how she oscillates between predator and prey.
Yeah.
How does she classify humans, would be my first question. When she talks about them, do they oscillate? Do we oscillate as well? And then also, obviously, the 1960s, she leaves this earth. Who picks up the torch? Who picks up her torch?
Yeah.
Just to kind of give us a direction to go, like who took her work and carried it on?
A number of people, and I think in a lot of ways, Carson's work was taken up by the Audubon Society, and then EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, literally took on Carson's argument and then litigated. They converted it to litigation with great success, and ultimately the ban on DDT. Of course, in Banned, my book Banned, I argue that the organophosphates that replaced DDT were actually far more toxic, and they dominated agriculture for 30 years. And then that story actually, it's not over yet. The neonicotinoids, which were introduced in the 1990s, there's clear evidence that they're bioaccumulating, much like DDT, and that they're causing significant threat to grassland bird species. So there's this weird sort of cyclical nature in sort of the introduction. We regulate known risks, which means that when chemicals are newly introduced, the risks aren't known, and it's until the evidence mounts up that we can make that case. I think the American Bird Conservancy has worked very, very hard to bring the risks of neonicotinoids to attention. Theo Colburn in 1996 published the book Our Children's Stolen Future. And in a lot of ways, she took up the mantle of Rachel Carson very directly. And she collaborated with a scientist and a science journalist. This is Theo Colburn, Our Stolen Future. And I say it was very direct because she focused on the chemicals like DDT, the chlorinated hydrocarbons specifically, but less on the potentiality of cancer and more on the potentiality of endocrine disruption, the disruption of reproductive effects in wildlife and humans alike. And a good friend of mine, Nancy Langston, Nancy's book, Toxic, is Nancy's? It definitely has toxic. I had to push toxic way down the list because my editors was told by the managing director that he would not publish another book with toxic in the main title. So I had to push it almost down to the end. Like I really wanted toxicity in there because the book is about toxicity, but I had to push it way down. But yeah, Our Stolen Future by Theo Colburn, she really took up Carson's legacy in that book. Oh, my dad died of Parkinson's. Anyway, that was the story that I was having trouble getting out. Yeah. So he lived till he was 82. I mean, he lived a long, full life, but the association's there.
So how do you write so you get angry and not make people feel hopeless?
Yeah, I find this is what I find so inspiring about Carson's writing, how she sort of animates stories. I mean, I've read the science, and most of it is incredibly dry and very, very difficult. And I spent a lot of time working through that in my book, Banned, the science. And yet Carson takes the very same articles and creates this, and animates them in a way that motivates people to action, not despondency. Because I think there's a real risk in telling the stories about the environment where things go from the past when they were good to the present where they're worse to the future where they're worse than that. There's not a whole lot of motivation in telling stories like that. Whereas I think Carson's works, her writings, and I think a lot of it is the sense of wonder. And she fully appreciated not just the wonder of nature, but the wonder of science to understand nature. And she really just was passionate about translating that for her audiences. Yeah, thank you.
There was one series on Netflix or something, The World, where the positive thing was Chernobyl because people left and the animals were allowed to thrive, right? I mean, they tried to get away from despondency, but that itself is a terrible.
Well, we saw that too during the shutdown, right? Where CO2 levels dropped dramatically, and it was almost like, if we accept the Gaia hypothesis, and Earth took a deep breath for that 6-month period during the global shutdown, and yeah, so there was something, wondrous about that moment, despite all the horror of the global pandemic. Can't end on that note.
So how about this? What do you recommend for all of us to do going forward from tonight? Any recommendations?
Well, I think what you have planned here at the university, I think what you're doing with students, I think the whole notion of this whole series, I think it's wonderful that you're focusing on the idea of wonder, because I think there's so many different ways to explore it, and I think it's such an important antidote to the challenges of these times. And I think the people who have experienced these challenges most directly are young people. I think I see it in our students, both our undergraduates and our graduate students, but I think it's very true for high school students as well. The challenge of the past 2 years has been so much more significant for them. For most of us, we found a way to sort of muddle through, but for them, I think students and young people really saw the challenge. So I think it's really wonderful that you created this series, and yeah, it's a pleasure to be a part of it. Thank you.
We have one more event in the series on April 20th. Yes. We're going to have a panel here who is going to talk about the wonders in our community around us, coming from various perspectives to how do you get out in this environment right here in central Indiana